Well, our understanding of who God is determines how we act, determines our worldview, determines just our morality, and those types of things. And while we wouldn't admit it, there are many people who view God to have a lot of similarities to a genie who is there to grant their wishes. Now, we wouldn't admit that. But a lot of times our prayers are centered around the objective to try to convince God that our way is the best way. God, this is what I need. Can you do this and help me? But I would argue the opposite is actually closer to reality. Instead of God being the genie to grant our wishes, I think the reality is that we are the one who is made to grant God's wishes. Now let me pause for a minute. We recognize God can do anything. He doesn't need us to accomplish His purposes. He can fulfill anything He wants, with or without us, but He chooses to work through you and me. And so our objective is to work with God for His purposes. Not to convince God that His purposes are wrong so that He agrees with us. But what would happen if we lived as though God's wishes were our commands? A lot of ways that would limit some selfishness that we naturally have. But I also think it would call us to do some pretty crazy things. That we would live life not necessarily recklessly, but with more courageous faith. And so we come to David's mighty men. We've been talking about them. We talked about the three chiefs, the three leaders. We had Adino, we had Eleazar, and Shammah. And they were the top three. And they did some crazy things. They had some exploits. And so far we looked at individual exploits, but today we're going to look at a story that shows all three of them working together. And we picked that up in 2 Samuel 23, starting in verse 13. And so the story shows that once, it was during the harvest, when David was in the cave of Adullam, the Philistine army was camped in the valley of Rephaim. The three mighty men, Shammah, Eleazar, and Adino, they were among the 30 who were an elite group of David's fighting men. They went down to meet David in the cave of Adullam. David was in the stronghold, and the Philistine detachment had occupied the town of Bethlehem. So it's harvest time, and it was time that was very busy for a lot of different people. David is the king, and so he had a lot of different responsibilities that he needed to make sure got done in order for the country to function properly. So he was balancing the military needs and the harvest needs of the country. There were a lot of things had to go in to make sure the harvest was brought in. They didn't have heavy equipment and machinery like we do to bring in the harvest, so it was very labor-intensive. But it's also a very dangerous time. When the Philistines were there, when the enemy is there during harvest time, I know I've mentioned this before, but we find that it's dangerous because you're exposed. The enemy could steal your crops or destroy your crops, really hurting you. Israel could have been hurt because of what the Philistines did, and it wouldn't have necessarily taken very much effort from the Philistines to cause major problems for the Israelites. So the three mighty men show up, Adino, Eleazar, and Shammah. They show up, and there's a need arose, and so they're there all of a sudden. Now, as I mentioned, what we looked at before are just their individual exploits, their individual heroic events of these three men. But I find it interesting that now they bring them all together because they are still part of the team. They're still part of the group. They're still part of the military. These mighty men are not like CIA operatives or James Bond working alone. They're part of the team. They're part of the group that is working for the good of Israel. And so David's in this cave of Adullam. You may remember this. This is a cave that David hid out in and to find refuge when King Saul was chasing him and trying to kill him. But it was a stronghold. He was in a place that was secure, in a place that was more easily defended than other places. Now, at the same time, caves can be pretty dangerous places. It can be real easy to get lost in the cave, to get trapped in the cave. We do remember David is in kind of his home turf area, an area that he's fairly familiar with. So the likelihood of him getting trapped on accident was probably unlikely, but it still is a dangerous situation, a place where he was fortified against the enemy. With the mighty men coming, it was almost as though they had like a war council. Now, it's not specifically clear that these mighty men were those who would speak in and give advice to David, but they were part of the group that was invited into the inner circle, the close group of people that David worked with for the military of Israel. Now, this Adullam area is west-ish of Bethlehem. And Bethlehem is about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. And then the Valley of Rephaim is kind of west and northwest of Jerusalem. So the enemy, Philistines, are kind of north and west of where David is, just to give you kind of a general mindset. But we remember that Jerusalem is the capital city. It was the capital of Israel. It was the holy city. It was a place that everything happened. Now, the temple was not yet built. David's son Solomon is one who would build the temple, but even though the temple wasn't there, it was still the holy city. Still the city that was the one that was just extra special in God's eyes as the Israelites understood it. But it's kind of hard to differentiate between the political and the spiritual in Israel, because God was their leader, the ultimate leader, and everything they did was supposed to run through God and his purposes, but it was also the political area. But we see this intertwined. So the city of Jerusalem was extremely important. But the Philistines were between David and the capital city. So they had broken David's line from Jerusalem to where he was. That's how close they were and how much they've infiltrated the nation of Israel. Now, Bethlehem is about 5-ish miles from Jerusalem. Let's just think about this a moment. If in our country there was a real threat, our greatest enemy, if they were camped 5 miles from Washington, D.C., we would be panicked. That would be very disheartening for us, or disconcerting. We do recognize that proximity is a little different today with rockets and all those types of things. They don't have to be that close in order to be dangerous. But this was the situation David was in, situation that Israel was in, that they were really in a tough spot. The Philistines, their greatest enemy, they were infiltrating the country at a dangerous time, a time that they could instill a lot of problems for them. So David is with his mighty men, and he remarks in a kind of a longing statement. He says, "Oh, how I wish I could have some of that good water from the well by the gate of Bethlehem." So here's what the three did. They broke through the Philistine camp. They drew water from the well by the gate in Bethlehem and brought it back to David. That's what they did. Pretty crazy in my mind as to the fact that they just went ahead and did it. See, David just expresses thirst. He says he's thirsty, which is normal. And David grew up in this area. Bethlehem was his hometown. That's where he grew up. He grew up as a shepherd. And so whether he was a shepherd or when he became king, he was a military leader, water was a real need. It was something that you didn't always have enough of. When he was a shepherd, he had to make sure that he and his livestock had water in order to survive. When he was a military leader, he had to make sure he and his soldiers had water in order to survive. So it was something that they just lived with, a reality that they lived with in their time. Now, we have the modern luxury. When we need a drink, we can just go turn on the faucet and water just magically appears. If you've ever gone to the faucet and water didn't appear, you're like, what is happening? What is wrong? And so there's a problem if it doesn't actually come out of the faucet. If asked, we recognize that the water that we have today is a huge luxury that David didn't have. But we also recognize David has the same physical needs that we have. It's not as though our physical needs have changed. We need water just as much as David needed water. But as I was thinking about this, David is just expressing a sentimental desire. He wants this water from the well by the gate in Bethlehem. Now, was that water any better than any other water around? Probably not. But I really understand where David is coming from. My hometown of Potomac, Illinois, has these artesian wells. And if you're unfamiliar with artesian wells, what's really happened is that the aquifer has built up positive pressure that allows the water to flow without a pump. So it just is a naturally flowing well. So my town has hundreds of those around, and there are several that are in public places that people can go and access them whenever they desire. But for me, that water tastes so good. It's just wonderful water. So when Hannah and I were together, I took her to my hometown, and I talked up this water. I said, it's the best water you can have anywhere. It is God's gift to creation, this water is. And Hannah took one drink of that water, and she says, well, it's well water. Because that's all it is. There's nothing actual special about this water that's different from other types of well water. But to me, it means something. Because I grew up, in fact, one of the biggest ones, I was 3 houses down from growing up. And that's what David is longing for. He's not longing for this water because it literally is better than any other water. He's longing for this water because it was something from his childhood that he couldn't get. So he recognized that the Philistines were in the way. So defeating the Philistines not only would free the country, not only would protect the country, but it would allow David to access the sentimental desires that he had. See, his expression here was not a military order. It was a sentimental wish. And these mighty men, the 3, they heard this, and they're part of the Special Forces unit. They're part of the elite group of David's mighty men. And you know what they did? Is they took David's wish as their command, which is exactly what we're supposed to do, because God's wishes are our command, and their response was to break through the enemy lines. They broke through the Philistines. They fought their way through to get the water for David. Now, we don't have a time frame here. We don't have an ability to see how long this actually took, but I just get the impression that this was kind of a smash and grab operation. It didn't take weeks and months of planning. They said, David wants this, let's go now, and let's go take care of this for our leader. Now, this is kind of a typical imagery we get of people like the mighty men. We think of their exploits, and so they just went for it. Now, they were the best of the best, but yet success was not guaranteed. It was still a dangerous situation that they were putting themselves into. It likely was not a covert operation. It wasn't under the cover of darkness. They went, they fought their way through, they got water, and they brought it back. But we also have to recognize that this was a 26-mile round trip from the cave of Adullam to Bethlehem. So they ran a marathon just to get their leader a drink of water. You know how much water they had to drink in order to successfully do this mission? I mean, just think of the logistics, how this just does not make sense. But that's what we are called to do in serving God. God's wishes are our command. And they brought water to David. They weren't following a military order. They weren't following a legalistic set of rules. They were following the wishes of their leader. But in order to know David's wishes, in order to hear what David was saying, they just didn't have to hear him, they had to know him. They had to have a relationship with him. It was more than just hearing something. It was actually knowing David's heart. So too many times the church gets caught up in these legalistic rules and ideas, and people get a bad rap because of what the church has done in the past. But what if we viewed following Jesus not as an allegiance to a leader, a ruler, but as love for our Savior? And it changes how we do what we do, and it changes why we do what we do. If we do it out of love, it changes, and it's no longer forced or coerced. And that's what I'm getting at when I say that God's wishes are our command. But that's not where the story ends. See, David gets the water, but he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured out the water on the ground as an offering to the Lord. And he exclaimed, "The Lord forbid I should drink this. This water is as precious as the blood of these men who sacrifice and risk their lives to bring it to me." So David didn't drink it. And these are the exploits of the three mighty men. Now, when I'm first reading this story, that's a bit of a twist for me. What, you're telling me they ran a marathon for you and you can't even take a drink of water just to show them your appreciation? Well, David actually honored them with what he did. He recognized he was not worthy to drink this water. They underwent this huge sacrifice, which they didn't have to. There was nothing that forced them to. There was no command. This was just a wish that David expressed. But they did it because they loved him. And it shows their deep bond with David. They weren't just following him because he sat on the throne. They were following him because they loved him. And they were willing to risk their lives just for his desires. Just for him to have a drink of water that wasn't any better than any other water that he could have gotten. But the victory of this moment is not that water was given to David, but it's that the enemy could be defeated, that the well at the gate of Bethlehem could be reached, that the enemy didn't have the control that they feared they did. So the retrieving of the water, the getting of the water, and the pouring the water out becomes a worshipful act. No longer are we focusing on the logistics, the fiscal responsibility, the reasoning aspect. We're focusing on how God is moving in this moment. So we have to be real careful. Pragmatism can be sinful. If everything we do is done just because it makes just because it's reasonable or makes fiscal sense or is going to help us out in the long run, then we've taken God out of the equation. Too many times we're very safe with what it means to be a follower of Jesus. We're so safe that if there's risk involved, we're not sure if we want to do that. These mighty men took risk for no reason except they loved their leader. They loved David and they followed him. Now, God doesn't call us to be foolish. Let me make sure we're clear on that. I'm not saying we need to live fast and loose with the checkbook all the time and just be irresponsible with our resources. Now, maybe God's calling you to be more generous. I'm not trying to dive into that concept today. But our spiritual needs are more important than our physical needs. In our world today of comfort, of security, we tend to forget that. We tend to forget how important it is to be spiritually where God wants us to be. So David gets this water and recognizes that this is not a physical need that he is being given. This is a spiritual moment, and he takes time to make sure that God is present in what he is doing. See, the only appropriate thing he could do with this water was to offer it to God. The only thing he could do to honor the actual three mighty men was to offer it to God. But from an Old Testament standpoint, what David does, it parallels the concept of Israel offering sacrifices. Because when they sacrifice a lamb, the blood of the lamb is poured out on the ground as an offering to God, recognizing that it belongs to God and it's because of God that it's valuable at all. So David is giving this to God. He's making sure that the three mighty men are honored in the best way that he knows possible. They underwent this huge sacrifice, and the reward was to be honored in the name of God because they were more important than the water. David recognized that even though this water meant so much to him, and the concept of being able to retrieve it, even though the enemy was there, was special and uplifting for all of Israel. And in this moment, we see part of David's humility and the fact that he recognizes that he is where he is not just because of his own ability. Now, it's true that God anointed David king of Israel. It was very clear. We find that earlier in 1 Samuel, where God sent the prophet Samuel to anoint David king. But it was the sacrifice of people like Adino and Eleazar and Shammah that actually allowed David to be where he was. Others helped David establish his reign and his leadership. And it was because of their sacrifice. And God calls us to do that. God's wishes are our command. And God invites us into a relationship of solidarity with Him. Not as equals. We're not equal with God. If we were equal with God, then God wouldn't be worth serving. But He invites us into a relationship with Him so that we can fulfill His purposes together. But above all else, we have to remember that we are servants. But I fear what happens is too many times we stop short of this crazy faith that the three mighty men displayed for their leader. We stop at the fact of, well, we've said a few words, we're saved, we do our part, we're going to live our life right off into the sunset until Jesus calls me home, and I'm good with that. God doesn't tell you just to stay where you are. In order to really be the servant that God calls us to be, we have to give of ourselves completely to Him. And we would refer to this as consecration. Consecration is to give of yourself completely to God. To not withhold anything. To give everything to who He is. We're going to sing the song, Take My Life and Let It Be Consecrated. I was going through the song earlier, and some of the lines just stuck out to me. It says, take my hands and let them move at the impulse of thy love. What if everything we did was because of God's love in us? That can only happen if we give ourselves completely to Him. Another line says, take my will and make it thine. It shall be no longer mine. You know, that's a big battle everybody faces. I want it my way. But if we want to live with crazy faith, if we want to live with courageous faith, then we have to go to God and say, I don't want it to be my will anymore. I want to be your will in my life. It's about giving of ourselves completely to Him. God's wishes are your command. Are you living that way? Are you living as though God's wishes are your suggestions? Or God's wishes are good ideas you should follow? Because there's a difference. And it's a matter of giving ourselves completely to Him.